Probably 80% of the people I talk to when I tell them I'm a pilot, they say, oh, I've always wanted to be a pilot, or, I started my pilot training, but I just never finished, or, I got my pilot's license, but I never use it, and on and on and on and on. Everyone dreams of becoming a pilot and loves the idea of flying, but it's just always out of the reach for people who don't actually have a use for that. And the question is, why is that? And furthermore, is there anything that you and I can do about it right now today? Let's talk about it. There was a day, and it wasn't too long ago, that airports were filled with general aviation airplanes. Bonanzas, Cessnas, little airplanes that people would just fly from city to city. In fact, I remember seeing a picture of the airport up in Minot, where I took some of my flight training. It's just north of us. The ramp was full of general aviation airplanes. They were everywhere. Everyone used them, everyone loved them, and most people could afford them. So what happened? I think if you talk to most people in the general aviation world, they would say the reason they don't fly an airplane of their own is because they just can't afford to buy an airplane. These things are going for insane amounts of money. And so if you don't need it for, say, a business, like the reason we bought our plane, it really just doesn't pencil out. And so what you end up with, and you look around, and fewer young people are getting into general aviation just to fly their own Bonanza or their own, Cessna Twin. They're getting into it just to fly on the airlines, some of them, but, in my area, I'm the only young guy that I know who is really getting into general aviation without the idea of getting to the airlines or, flying a Cessna Caravan for FedEx or whatever. In fact, I'm 22 years old and I'm already on the Airport Authority Board because there really isn't anybody else in our town with a pilot's license who's really passionate about flying and continuing this general aviation dream in our city that's not getting up there in years. In fact, I had a friend of mine who he worked really hard to get his pilot's license. He actually got it before me, and he put in his hours, and I remember he spent the time, he spent the money, and I remember thinking, wow, that's so cool, and I wanted to do that. This is before I even started my pilot training, and he really put in the time, really put in the effort, and he passed his check ride. And then he would go on flights, and I thought, wow, that's cool. And I just talked to him the other day, and I said, when have you been up? And he said, man, I haven't been up in years. He said, if I wanted to go up, I would want to get some recurring training. I definitely have to get checked out. I don't even think my medical is valid anymore. I'd have to get, a new medical and everything. And I'm like, well, what happened? And he said, life kicked in. I couldn't afford it. I got married. I want to start a family. I got a business I'm trying to start. It's a dream that one of these days I'll do, but it's just not feasible right now. Now, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from getting their pilot's license because they think they'll never fly after they get their pilot's license. I don't know of one person who just bit the bullet and got their pilot's license who regrets it afterwards. Even if they never really fly again, it's never something you regret, and it's a huge investment, and I understand that. And people say, well, don't you feel bad about investing all that money just to never use it? And I've never heard of a pilot who said that. Never. No, I've never heard a pilot who passed their check ride say, I never used my pilot's license. What a waste of money. I'm sure there are pilots who have said that, but I've never heard it because it's not a very common ideology amongst pilots because pilot's licenses never expire. So I'm not trying to discourage anybody who is working on their pilot's license. In fact, if anything, go get it done. Go get it done. Get it done as fast as you can, as cheap as you can. And even if you can't afford to fly afterwards, just get it done. It never expires. And so I'm not trying to discourage anyone, but why is that so often the case? People get their pilot's license and they can never afford to fly. Well, obviously, money has a big thing to do with it. The cost of these airplanes are just atrocious. But that's not the only thing holding the markets back. It wasn't probably 100 years ago when only the richest people could drive a car. Maybe 150 years ago when, only the top of the top could drive cars. Now, everyone has a car. In fact, if you're even lower middle class, you probably have 2 cars. And so on and so forth. And so the real issue is a lack of interest in general aviation. You say, that's crazy. You just said everyone wants to be a pilot. That's true. Everyone does want to be a pilot. And yet, because there's not such an obvious practical side to general aviation, it holds so many people back, and it just stays a dream as opposed to actually becoming a reality. With cars, they could do everything so much better than horses. And so people were willing to make that jump because it was practical, and then the market's caught up, and then now everyone can afford one. And that is possible with airplanes, but more and more people have to see the practical side of what airplanes can do for them. And so there are a few great things coming up in aviation, in the aviation world today. The first one is experimental aircraft, because what happened after the boom of like the 60s and 70s, right after World War II, somewhere in there, is that we had a lot of crashes because there was a ton of pilots and they were all flying. And so the FAA came in and said, okay, we're going to regulate everything. Regulate. So now to build an airplane is super expensive, it's super regulated. But again, not necessarily more than a car, but because there's not as much of a demand, airplane manufacturers are paying for all this regulation, and because they're not going to sell nearly as many airplanes as you might sell a Toyota Camry, they have to charge each person who buys that airplane more for the R&D that went into it. So the caveat they created for that was experimental aircraft. And I love experimental aircraft, and I love what they're doing. You're seeing more and more companies just pop up every single day. And I really think that this could be, the wave of the future. And also they're expanding some of the, weight ratings for light sport aircraft, which require less certification and less regulation to fly. And so some of these type things are going to help people get excited about aviation. It's going to make it more affordable for everybody. These days you can pay up to $100,000 for a F-150 brand new, Raptor or whatever. Cars are getting to that point. Well, you can buy an airplane for under $100,000, especially in this experimental market. And it'll actually be pretty practical if you have, say, a 2-hour commute. Turn that 2-hour commute into a 1-hour commute with some of these airplanes for under $100,000. And now you have a very practical machine. So that's one way that airplanes could start getting lower and cheaper for everybody, is if people start using them for more practical purposes and creating a buzz and creating more demand in this space. But the second way things could start getting more affordable for everybody is actually by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and just leaving a comment. And you're saying, okay, what a cop-out, this is ridiculous. But no, I'm not just saying this channel, I'm saying any aviation channel. Because what's amazing about YouTube and some of these social medias is that it creates excitement around whatever they're doing. People like Trent Palmer, people like Mike Patey, these guys are doing amazing things for the aviation community. And if you continue to watch these guys and boost their videos by liking and subscribing to their channels, the more and more excitement will be gathered around this general aviation sector. And the more excitement that's gathered around this, the more people who want to buy in. How many Kit Foxes have been sold because of Trent Palmer? I'd have to imagine a lot. How many, people want to be like Mike Patey and build another Draco? There's so on and on and on and on. People are getting excited about general aviation. And the more people who get excited, the more people who buy into it, the cheaper it gets for everybody. So go ahead and drop a like, go ahead and subscribe, and comment on this video and other videos like it, and let's get excited about aviation, because that'll bring down the cost for everybody. And hopefully one of these days we can all afford to fly an airplane. Well, that's my take on the subject. Thank you for watching. This has been The Aviator. See you in the next one.